This is Samuel, and on that cold, rainy night his faith became the joke that almost cost everyone in that car their lives. In the back seat, a couple mocked the worship music playing softly on the radio, the sound that to him was a balm for the soul. They didn't know it, but the man they despised was, at that very moment, praying for their protection. Their arrogance was as loud as the storm outside, but God's silence was about to speak louder. Has your faith ever been tested to the point where you had to pray for those who humiliate you? Before I tell you how God used that man's faith to silence the mockery and perform an unbelievable deliverance, comment here where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place humiliation and the steering wheel in His hands. The night in Sao Paulo had that heavy, cold air that only a downpour can bring. The lights from the buildings and headlights blurred on the windshield, creating a smear of colors that looked more like a sad painting. For Samuel, driving in these conditions was a test of patience and skill. But the real test wasn't on the slippery road, but in the back seat. Lucas and Juliana got into the car, bringing with them the smell of an expensive restaurant and an air of superiority that filled the small space of the vehicle. The first disdainful glance was at the discreet rosary hanging from the rear-view mirror. The second was at the soft worship music coming from the speakers. Samuel felt the atmosphere change instantly, like a cold front arriving without warning. The car, which was his livelihood and his small refuge, suddenly became a courtroom. At first it was just whispers and giggles. Samuel, focused on the traffic, tried to ignore them. He knew that tone. It was the sound of prejudice, of those who judge a book by its cover and a man by the color of his skin or the music he listens to. He was 55 years old and knew that some battles are not won with shouts, but with silence and prayer. Still, a pang of pain hit him. It was the same pain he felt as a young man when he heard veiled jokes, the same discomfort of being measured and judged by people who didn't know a third of his story, his struggle, the widowhood that taught him to be a father and mother to his granddaughter, the faith that kept him on his feet every day. That car was a sacred place where he talked to God, and it was being profaned. Can you change this station? I didn't. Pay for a church service. Lucas's voice came out loud and loaded with sarcasm, breaking the sound of the rain and the worship music. Juliana let out a little laugh, as if it were the smartest joke in the world. Samuel gripped the steering wheel a little tighter, feeling the knuckles of his fingers turn white. His first reaction, the human one, was to respond in kind, to say that the car was his, that the rules were his, to kick them out and deal with the negative rating on the app. But then a calm that did not come from him began to fill his chest. He remembered what his late wife always said: anger is a poison we drink, hoping the other person will die. He took a deep breath, counting to 3 in his mind, asking God for the patience he lacked at that moment. He looked at the couple in the rearview mirror. Lucas had a victorious smile on his face, waiting for a reaction, a fight, anything that would confirm the image he had of people like Samuel. People, in his mind, who were either passive or explosive. Black men who, to him, were only meant to be in a subservient position, and any sign of self-identity, like faith, was a reason for mockery. Juliana, for her part, seemed a little more uncomfortable, but her complicity in the mockery was clear. She hid behind her boyfriend's arrogance. Samuel saw in them an impatient youth, wealth that had not brought wisdom, and the spiritual blindness of those who believe they control their own destiny. He felt more pity than anger, a deep sadness for those two souls lost in the darkness of their own pride. Samuel's silence seemed to bother them more than any sharp reply. Lucas insisted, drumming his fingers on the armrest. So, driver, are you going to turn off the music, or are we going to have to hear about the Lamb of God all the way to Itaim Bibi? The provocation was direct, calculated to humiliate. They didn't just want silence, they wanted submission. They wanted him to erase a piece of himself to please them. At that moment, Samuel was no longer a service provider. He was a target. And the trial he was experiencing there, in that confined and damp space, was the same one that so many brothers and sisters in faith face every day. The choice between fighting back with the world's logic or responding with the wisdom that comes from above. The choice to be salt and light, even when the world prefers darkness and bitterness. It was then that the first turn of events occurred. With a serenity that completely disarmed the atmosphere, Samuel adjusted the rearview mirror to meet Lucas's gaze. His voice came out gentle but firm, without a hint of tremor or anger. This music calms my soul, my young friends, and on a rainy night like this, all peace is welcome. There was no challenge in his tone, just a statement of fact. A truth so simple and powerful that Lucas's sarcasm seemed to wither in the air. The young man opened his mouth to reply, but found no words. What can you say to a man who, instead of throwing a stone back, offers a piece of his peace? The reaction he expected, the anger, the argument, did not come, and in its absence, an uncomfortable vacuum settled in. Immediately after he spoke, Samuel closed his eyes for a second, an almost imperceptible moment for anyone not paying attention, but for him, it was an eternity of connection. He did not ask God to punish the couple. He did not ask for revenge or immediate justice. His prayer was silent, a whisper from his heart to the Father. Lord, give me the patience to finish this ride. Shield me from this affront, and above all, protect the lives of all of us in this car. May your angel accompany us. As he opened his eyes, he felt a lightness take over his shoulders. The offense no longer weighed so heavily. He had placed the affront in the hands of the one who knows how to take care of all things. The internal battle was won. The atmosphere inside the car transformed. The tension, once provocative and noisy, became dense and silent. Lucas shrank back in his seat, visibly disconcerted. Juliana stopped fiddling with her phone and stared intently at the raindrops trickling down the window, as if seeking a distraction from the embarrassment she felt. The worship music continued to play, now at an even lower volume, but its presence seemed to have grown. It was no longer just background music. It was the soundtrack to the strange peace that Samuel emanated. The man they had tried to belittle had become, with a few words, the moral authority within that vehicle. They learned in that instant that there is a strength not measured in money or status, a silent strength that resides in the faith of a righteous man. The silence that followed Samuel's response was heavier than any argument. Lucas, who was used to winning any debate with his aggressive posture and status, leaned back in his seat with a closed expression. He had been disarmed, not with an attack, but with a peace he couldn't comprehend, and for that reason despised even more. Juliana looked out the window, but her eyes didn't see the city. She felt an embarrassment that burned inside her, a shame for her boyfriend's attitude and for her own complicity. The atmosphere in the car shifted from hostile to strangely solemn. The worship music, though quiet, seemed to fill every cubic inch of that space, no longer as an offense, but as a constant and unshakable presence, a silent testament to the strength that inhabited the driver. Samuel, for his part, felt no triumph. He did not rejoice in the couple's discomfort. In his heart there was a genuine compassion. He saw two young people lost in arrogance, believing that money and social position were shields against the storms of life. He knew that the real storms were not the ones falling from the sky, but those that formed within the soul. As he drove the car with redoubled skill through the increasingly dangerous streets, he continued his silent conversation with God. He no longer prayed for himself, but for them. He prayed that somehow that night would serve to open the couple's eyes to something bigger than themselves, something money couldn't buy nor mockery could diminish. The rain, which had been merely heavy, now transformed into a deluge. Thick curtains of water crashed down on the city, and the sound on the car's roof was like an incessant, furious drumbeat. The windshield wipers at maximum speed could barely clear a sliver of visibility. The streets began to accumulate dangerous pools of water, and the traffic, once just slow, now became chaotic and unpredictable. Samuel felt the car threaten to hydroplane with every waterlogged stretch. It was one of those nights when the city of São Paulo showed its wildest side, a monster of concrete and asphalt that could swallow the unwary. The peace he felt in his spirit contrasted violently with the chaos that was brewing outside. Samuel's concentration was absolute. Every movement of the steering wheel, every touch of the brake or accelerator was calculated, with the precision of someone who knows his own vehicle and the road like the back of his hand. He wasn't just driving, he was navigating through a storm, aware that the lives of 3 people depended on his calm and his skill. He remembered other nights like this one, other challenges he had faced alone at the wheel, and in all of them he felt the same presence by his side, the same certainty that he was not alone. Faith, for him, was not just for moments on his knees in church, but for moments with firm hands on the wheel in the midst of the tempest. The uncomfortable silence was broken again by Lucas's voice, who, unable to bear the loss of control, tried to find a new flaw, a new way to reassert himself. "Are you sure this is the best way? The app is showing an alternative route. It seems faster." The tone was casual, but the intention was clear: to question Samuel's competence, to undermine his authority as a driver. It was a last-ditch effort to regain command, to prove that his technology and his worldview were superior to the experience of this simple man. He wasn't asking. He was asserting that Samuel was wrong, once again. The mockery changed its target, from faith to profession. Juliana, picking up on the cue, added, looking at Lucas's phone screen, "It's true, honey. This area always floods. My dad always avoids this avenue on rainy days." The complicity between them was restored, now based on a supposed urban wisdom they believed they possessed. They united again against the driver, trying to cast him as an amateur, an ignorant man who didn't know what he was doing. For them, it was inconceivable that this man, with his simple car and his religious music, could know more than a GPS algorithm or the advice of a successful businessman. The humiliation continued, just changing its disguise, testing Samuel's patience on a new front. Samuel heard the suggestion and the veiled criticism. He knew that avenue like few others. He knew that, although it seemed more flooded, it was the only one with a drainage system that, even when overloaded, worked better than the narrow, low-lying streets the app suggested. The alternative route was a trap, a path that on nights like this turned into a river of dirty water, where cars got stuck and drivers became desperate. A quick memory came to his mind. Years ago, in the early days of his widowhood, he had been trapped in a flood like that, with his young granddaughter in the car. The panic he felt that day taught him to never again blindly trust technology over lived experience. He didn't bother to give a long explanation. He knew it would be useless. They didn't want an explanation. They wanted to be right. With the same calm as before, he replied, without taking his eyes off the dangerous road ahead. "This is the safest way, my young friend. I ask you to trust me." The word trust hung in the air, charged with a much greater meaning. It was an invitation, almost a plea, for them to place a modicum of faith not in God but in him, the man whose skill was keeping them safe. He wasn't asking them to believe in his religion, but in his ability to protect them. His response was not a defense, but a demonstration of confidence that left them once again speechless. The avenue ahead was a war zone. Water was rising over the sidewalks, and some cars, hasty and reckless, cut off others, throwing waves of dirty water everywhere. Brake lights flashed through the curtain of rain, and the sound of nervous horns mixed with the roar of the storm. Samuel saw a car further ahead make a risky maneuver to avoid a large puddle, nearly losing control. The danger was real, palpable. The tension inside the car was no longer just about faith or GPS routes. It had transformed into a shared, primal fear, the awareness that life was fragile and they were at the mercy of the storm. For the first time that night, Lucas and Juliana were genuinely quiet. The mockery vanished from their faces, replaced by a mask of apprehension. They looked outside and saw the same thing Samuel did: chaos. Their safe, predictable world, governed by apps and social status, had dissolved in the flood. Now they were in a simple car driven by a man they had despised, and their only hope of reaching their luxury apartment safely was the skill of that same man. The irony of the situation was crushing. The power, which they thought was in their bank accounts and their commanding voices, had changed hands. Now power was in Samuel's firm hands on the steering wheel. The avenue became a river of dark, gleaming asphalt, reflecting the city lights in a distorted and menacing way. Every car that passed in the opposite direction sent a wave crashing against Samuel's vehicle, making it rock slightly, a constant reminder of the fragility of their position. Lucas and Juliana were now completely silent, their bodies rigid with tension. Lucas's phone, once the source of his arrogance and his better roots, was forgotten in his hand, its screen dark. All his confidence in technology and in himself had evaporated, replaced by a raw fear he didn't know how to disguise. His eyes were fixed on the road, or what little could be seen of it, and he followed Samuel's every move with desperate attention. Samuel could feel their fear in the air. It didn't satisfy him. On the contrary, it saddened him. He didn't want the fear of God to come through panic, but through revelation and love. However, he knew that the Lord works in mysterious ways, and that sometimes the storm must rage for people to seek a safe harbor. He remembered a passage the pastor had preached last Sunday about the storm Jesus calmed on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples, experienced seamen, were terrified, while Jesus slept peacefully. The peace of Christ was not the absence of a storm, but trust in the Father even in the midst of it. And it was this peace that Samuel sought to manifest at that moment. With every puddle, the car would jolt, and Juliana would let out a small, stifled gasp. She clutched the safety handle above the door as if her life depended on it. Her face was pale in the dim light coming through the window. In her eyes, Samuel saw not just fear but something more, a glimmer of regret. It was the look of someone who realizes, too late, the extent of their own arrogance. The man she and her boyfriend had humiliated was now the only barrier between them and a potentially fatal accident. Their dependence was total, and this reversal of power was a more effective lesson in humility than any sermon. Suddenly, a few meters ahead, the chaos took a concrete and terrifying form. A luxury car, an imported sedan that probably cost more than Samuel would earn in years of work, came at high speed in the left lane, as if the driver thought himself immune to the laws of physics. As it drove through a large pool of water, the inevitable happened. The vehicle hydroplaned, the driver completely lost control, and the car began to spin on the road like an out-of-control top. It was a dance of death, coming straight towards them. Time seemed to stretch, making every fraction of a second an eternity of dread. Juliana's scream was sharp and piercing, a sound of pure terror that tore through the tense silence in the car. Lucas instinctively flinched, covering his head with his arms like a child expecting an inevitable blow. All his air of superiority, all his pose of a man in control, disintegrated in a gesture of absolute panic. Their world, safe and protected by walls of money and privilege, was about to collide with harsh reality. Death made no distinction of social class, and at that moment, they were as vulnerable as anyone else on earth. The end seemed certain, a matter of 1 or 2 seconds, but Samuel did not flinch. He did not scream. The moment the chaos materialized, a supernatural clarity took over his mind. Fear vanished, replaced by an intense focus and a calm that defied the logic of the situation. He didn't see an out-of-control car coming to kill them. He saw a test. He saw the culmination of his entire ordeal that night. His silent prayer, which had accompanied him throughout the journey, now became audible, not as a desperate plea but as a declaration of faith and surrender. With a firm voice that rose above the sound of the rain and the scream of panic, he said a single phrase, "Lord, into your hands." In the same instant, his hands and feet moved with a precision that was not just the fruit of years of experience. It was something more. It was a guided reflex, an inspired skill. He didn't slam on the brakes, which would have caused his own car to skid and sealed their fate. Instead, with a fluid and exact movement, he turned the steering wheel just the right amount, accelerating slightly to gain traction, and passed by the side of the spinning car. It was an extremely risky maneuver, requiring a perfect reading of time, space, and grip. For an instant that seemed to last a lifetime, the two vehicles passed each other, so close that Samuel could see the terrified face of the other driver. Samuel's car passed through unscathed. The side of the out-of-control sedan missed his door by inches, so close that the sound of metal and wind cutting through the air was a frightening hum inside the vehicle. Immediately after, the spinning car hit the avenue's protective barrier, with a dull metallic thud, finally coming to a stop in a tangle of smoke and wreckage. Samuel, with the same inexplicable calm, gently guided his car to the shoulder a few meters ahead, away from the accident, and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was the most absolute and deafening any of them had ever experienced. Inside the car, the only sound was the heavy rain beating on the roof and 3 hearts pounding out of sync. No one moved, no one spoke. The smell of burnt rubber and ozone mixed with the humid air. Lucas slowly lowered his arms, his face as pale as wax, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He looked at the crash site, then at Samuel, and then back at the crash site again, as if his brain refused to process what had just happened. They should have been dead or at best seriously injured, but there they were, stopped, untouched, safe and sound. Juliana was trembling uncontrollably. tears streaming silently down her face. She wasn't crying from fear, but from relief, from shock, from an emotion so overwhelming she couldn't name it. Her gaze was fixed on Samuel, on the back of the neck of the man they had ridiculed. She no longer saw a simple driver, a believer who listened to cheesy music. She saw an angel, an instrument, the personification of a force she never believed existed. The mockery, the arrogance, the prejudice, all of it seemed so small, so petty, and so stupid in the face of the magnitude of what they had just experienced. That man's faith was not a weakness, it was a shield, and that shield had just saved their lives. The silence inside the car was denser than the fog that was beginning to form with the rain. It was a reverent silence, full of unasked questions and answers that needed no words. Lucas, the man who minutes before was full of sarcasm and superiority, now looked like a frightened boy. He looked at his own trembling hands as if he didn't recognize them. Reality hit him with the force of a collision. His intelligence, his money, his social position were worthless in the face of imminent death. He was saved not by who he was, but by the faith of a man he considered inferior. The humiliation he felt now came not from the outside, but from within, a deep shame for his own spiritual smallness. Samuel remained quiet for a long moment, allowing time for the shock to dissipate and for reality to settle in the couple's hearts. He turned on the hazard lights, picked up his cell phone, and with the same usual calm, dialed the number for emergency services, reporting the accident with precision and clarity, as if describing a scene from a movie, not something that had almost taken his life. He didn't seem shaken, he didn't seem heroic, he just seemed at peace. A peace that for Lucas and Juliana was the most disconcerting and miraculous thing of that entire night. How could a man go through that and remain so serene? The answer was in the worship music still playing softly on the radio, a melody that now sounded like the soundtrack to a miracle. After hanging up the phone, Samuel turned slowly in his seat. His eyes met Lucas's and Juliana's. There was no accusation in his gaze, not a hint of, "I told you so." There was only a deep compassion, the same he had felt at the beginning of the trip. He saw the transformation on their faces, the arrogance shattered, replaced by a genuine awe. He knew that God had worked there not only a physical deliverance, but the beginning of a spiritual work. The seed had been planted in the most unlikely soil, fertilized by the storm and by fear. Mockery had turned into reverence, disbelief into wonder. Lucas opened his mouth to speak, but what came out was a choked sound. He tried again, his voice trembling and unrecognizable. I don't know what to say. We would be dead. How did you do that?" The question wasn't about the maneuver itself, but about the strength behind it. He didn't want a technical explanation. He wanted to understand the source of that calm, of that supernatural reflex. He was, for the first time in his life, admitting that there was something beyond his comprehension, a power he couldn't control or explain with his materialistic logic. He was asking for help to understand what his own eyes had seen, but his mind refused to accept. Samuel gave a gentle smile, a smile that seemed to light up the dark interior of the car. "It wasn't me, my young man. It was his hands that guided mine." The prayer you heard was not one of desperation but of surrender. When you truly trust, he takes the wheel. The simplicity of the answer was like a punch to Lucas's gut. There was no complicated theology, no doctrine. There was only a pure, direct truth. Faith in action. What for him and Juliana was a reason for jokes, the lamb, the prayer, the trust in God, was in fact a real, practical and life-saving power. The faith they despised was the only thing that had kept them alive. The rest of the trip to the luxury building in Itaim Bibi was made in a transformative silence. It was no longer the awkward silence from before, but a silence of deep reflection. The rain began to subside, as if the storm had fulfilled its purpose and was now calming down. The streets remained wet, but the danger seemed to have passed. When Samuel stopped the car in front of the imposing gate of the condominium, the world outside looked the same, but everything inside that car had changed forever. Lucas and Juliana were no longer the same people who had entered that vehicle hours earlier. They had witnessed something that would mark them for the rest of their lives. At the end of the ride, Lucas took out his wallet. With his hands still slightly trembling, he pulled out all the bills he had, a significant amount, and extended it to Samuel. "Please accept this. It's the least I can do. I'm so sorry. For everything." His voice was choked, his eyes welling up. That apology wasn't just for the mockery. It was for his blindness, for his prejudice, for his arrogance. It was the acknowledgement of his error in a way that money couldn't express, but he knew no other way to do it. Juliana, beside him, just nodded, the tears rolling down her face again. Samuel looked at the money in Lucas's hand, and with immense kindness, pushed the young man's hand back. He didn't touch a single bill. "Keep your money, my son. Thank him, not me." His gaze was firm, but loving. "The honor I received tonight is priceless. Use this experience to reflect. May he give you a good night and a new dawn." With that blessing, he unlocked the doors. He didn't want their money. He wanted their souls. Samuel's victory was not financial. It was spiritual. His honor was not restored by a tip, but by the visible manifestation of the power of his faith, which silenced the mockers and saved their lives. Lucas and Juliana got out of the car, as if in a trance. They stood on the sidewalk, under the light drizzle that was now falling, and watched Samuel's car drive away slowly and disappear into the São Paulo night. They stood there, motionless, for a long time, the money still in Lucas's hand, now a useless symbol of a power that couldn't save them. They entered the luxurious lobby of their building, but the gleam of the marble and crystal seemed dull and lifeless. They had gone out for an expensive dinner to celebrate a material achievement and returned with the testimony of a miracle. Their world had been turned upside down by the faith of a simple man. That night, Samuel didn't get an extra tip, but something infinitely more valuable. He returned home to his granddaughter with a heart at peace and a strengthened soul. He didn't tell her about the mockery, only about the deliverance. He knelt beside his bed as he did every night and gave thanks. He gave thanks for the trial that strengthened his faith, for the storm that revealed God's power, and for the two restless souls who, that night, learned that true strength does not shout, does not retaliate, nor does it impose itself. True strength trusts, prays, and in the hour of the storm knows exactly where to look. The story of Samuel on that rainy night became a silent but powerful testimony. He remained the same soft-spoken man with a serene gaze, driving through the streets of São Paulo. But something had changed. The certainty of his faith became even more unshakable. He knew that God not only hears prayers, but uses them to work miracles in the most unexpected places, even in the back seat of a rideshare car, in the middle of a storm, in the hearts of those who mock. The justice of God, he learned once again, is not loud like thunder, but it can be as impactful as a lightning bolt that illuminates the darkness. Lucas and Juliana were never the same. That event was the crack through which the light began to enter. Arrogance gave way to a search. What began as a joke about a church service in the car ended with them months later, entering a small neighborhood church, seeking to understand the peace and strength they saw in that driver. Samuel's prayer for them, made in the midst of humiliation, was answered in a way that not even he could have imagined. God not only saved them from an accident, but set them on the path to eternal salvation. That car, for Samuel, continued to be his livelihood, but it became even more a sanctuary on wheels. Every passenger who entered was an opportunity, a soul to pray. For the rosary on the mirror and the worship music on the radio were no longer just part of his identity. They were tools of a silent and powerful ministry. He understood that his mission was not to convert with words, but to demonstrate the power of the gospel with his life, with his calm, with his unshakable faith, even when the world around him was hostile and mocking. The deliverance on that busy avenue was not just a car swerving, it was a swerving of destiny. Samuel's precise maneuver, guided by the hand of God, altered the route not only of two vehicles but of two lives. They were heading towards an abyss of arrogance and materialism, and they were forced to take a detour to the path of humility and faith. The price of mockery was paid not with punishment but with mercy, and that is divine justice in its purest form, transforming offense into an opportunity for redemption. That night the prayer of a humble man became the only thing that mattered. In a world that values noise, power, and appearance, Samuel's silent faith spoke louder than the storm, louder than arrogance, louder than the sound of an out-of-control car, and it proved that when all seems lost, the right direction is not in any app, but on bended knees and a heart surrendered into the hands of God. If you know someone who needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about how faith in God can move mountains. Thank you for listening.